It actually is really important to end by talking about remedies because we've all heard a lot of ideas and we've heard a lot of facts and we've heard a lot of information. But at the end of the day, we have to be doers. We just cannot be talkers and thinkers. We have to be doers. And so I'm really glad that we have an opportunity to talk concretely about some ideas, and that's why I ran down to get my book, because I'm going to be writing down furiously. And I'm glad that we have with us this extraordinary and wonderful panel. I didn't get intro notes, but you know who they are. And immediately to my left is Christina, hold on, let me get my bios. This is their fault. Christina Livingston, she's the executive director of ACCE and the ACCE Institute. And she began her career as a field organizer for Los Angeles Acorn and worked in South LA. And she's going to be talking with us quite a bit about organizing and kind of what we need to be doing at the grassroots level at this moment to address the issues we've been talking about at this conference. Next to her is Jack Boger, who I've known for many years as well. Jack joined the staff of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in 1978. He and I crossed paths when I was a young lawyer at LDF, and then he moved on to bigger and better things. He joined the UNC School of Law faculty in 1990 and was the dean of UNC Law School and also headed the UNC Center for Civil Rights. He also, when he was at LDF, was the chair of our poverty, what do we call it then? Poverty and Justice Program, and also was the chair of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council, PRAC. And so I'm thrilled that he's with us. And next to him is Phil Tegler, who's been a civil rights lawyer for 30 years. He's the executive director of PRAC and really one of the leading voices in the nation on housing policy and housing mobility work. And he has been a partner to LDF in our housing work and really is an essential resource on all of these issues. So this is going to be a kind of interactive discussion. I think what I would like to do, however, is give each of the panelists maybe 4 minutes to say something that they want to say about the remedies they're thinking about or what they think are the start and stop points of some of the remedies we should be talking about today. And then I hope we'll have a rich discussion in which I'll push them to explain what we ought to be doing. So why don't we start, actually let's start down at the end of the table with Phil Tegler.
Okay, thanks, Sherilyn. Well, where to begin? So I thought that I would begin with the Obama administration because we've heard a lot of very ambitious proposals made here, but I think if we look back at what the Obama administration tried to do on civil rights issues, it shows us perhaps what is politically possible in the next administration, what is sort of feasible from a political perspective, but also ambitious. And I want to particularly highlight the ways in which the Obama administration started to use top-down financial incentives to promote integrative policies and progressive policies. Now, I don't want to give them, a gold star. They've failed in many ways to achieve the promise of some of these programs. The biggest failure I want to start off with as my lead example is the Race to the Top education program from the Department of Education. This came out of the stimulus bill in 2009, and it was about $4 billion of competitive grant funds that went out to the states. And what the Department of Education did was require states to do things that were politically impossible or politically impossible to conceive of as a condition of applying for this pot of $4 billion. And this included politically very difficult things like raising the caps on the numbers of charter schools, and imposing teacher performance evaluation standards, things that were vehemently opposed by the teachers union, and yet state after state just caved in and passed these laws to qualify them for this money. Now, that race to the top approach, competitive grant funding to drive policy and to create the political will on the ground, I think is one of the best things that that the federal government can do to achieve the goals of the Kerner Commission. And I think it's important to note that Arne Duncan, after he left the Department of Education, the former secretary, expressed a lot of regret about not using the power that he had in that position to promote school integration. Over at HUD, where there was a much more explicit integration agenda, we saw some of the same approaches used in the Sustainable Communities Initiative, where HUD dangled funds for regions to come together across jurisdictional boundaries and across substantive silos to look at housing and transportation planning from a regional perspective. And dozens of regions came together to do this kind of integrated housing and transportation planning, including fair housing planning on a regional basis, something that would not have ever happened in those regions without this incentive coming from the federal government. And, it was a small program that ended shortly after the Republicans took over Congress in the midterms, but it points the way. And I remember a meeting we had early in the Obama administration with the Deputy Secretary at HUD, Ron Sims, and he sketched out what the vision was of that department. Sean Donovan, who was here 2 days ago, moving away from this formula grant system that HUD had of just doling out money by formula to thousands of jurisdictions across the country through the Community Development Block Grant Program and programs like that, and shifting that money over time to a competitive grant funding program that was based on policy goals that the federal government had, like fair housing and integration, kind of what Sherilyn was talking about in her speech. So that's one idea I want to put out there of something that's politically possible that we might hope to see the next time we are in power again.
Jack.
What a daunting panel. What a, remedies large and small. None of us is far-sighted enough, none of us is wise enough to really put our arms entirely around the challenge of white supremacy and racial segregation that the Kerner Commission report put together. And in a sense, Sherilyn, as you said, we're all appropriately humbled by the realization that there was this remarkable document so well diagnosing our national problems 50 years ago, and how much of it has not come to pass since. And then finally, it's a dark political moment right now, plainly. There's nothing that's going to happen at the national level in the next couple of years that will be particularly helpful. And yet, as both John Powell said and Senator Fred Harris said, it's often in the midst of times like this that really important things can begin to develop. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, but have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. We, I think, could be in such a moment now, not simply because of the energy that we see in this room and other places around the country that is emerging out of the resistance to the oppression that some are trying to impose. But there are demographic realities that we've not said enough about here that I think should help us think further ahead than 2 years or 4 years or even 8 years. There's no question that by 2050, this will be a majority non-white country, a majority non-white voting country. And therefore, while we need to do everything we can in the present moment, we also need to begin to think about policies that could be enacted by a more progressive political majority, some of them in the states, some of them at the national level. Think of two prior examples. It was during the 1920s, the Harding, the Coolidge, the Hoover era, that then progressive state of Wisconsin and the state of New York began to develop policies that when Roosevelt came in 1933, turned into Social Security, the unemployment insurance program, the National Labor Relations Act. Those were all state matters that were federalized. Think of the late 1950s and early 1960s state policies on poverty that became part of the Great Society programs, Medicare, and then, of course, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 5, and the Voting Rights Act of 65, and the Fair Housing Act of 68. So I think we need to think about the present realities, but I also think we need to look ahead a little and ask ourselves, what can we start preparing now for a more promising future? I'm a lawyer, and therefore I care about the legal parts of things. And as we get into this, I have a couple of things to say, but I'm going to stop right now.
Okay. Please, Steve.
Okay, so, you know, the Kerner report talks about the third path, right? The path that includes both ghetto enrichment and integration. And I think for me, I'm an organizer. I've been organizing for 15 years in California. I'm born and raised in California. So I have a very particular lens, and I know that it doesn't reflect the rest of the country necessarily, but I should say that. And of course, 50 years ago, I was 15 years BC, before Christina. I was on my path to birth and power. So I can't speak to the full length of time, but for the last 14 years that I have been organizing, I feel like I've learned some lessons that are going to be key for us, I think, as we move forward thinking about how to really implement real solutions. So on the piece around ghetto enrichment, I mean, that really requires policy and practice shifts, right? We've got to pass really impactful, useful policies and shifts in practices that affect people's lives. But that does not work if there's not deep community engagement, and if the folks who are affected by those policies are not central in understanding what the real issues are, the cuts on those issues, how they're actually affecting them in their daily lives, in the moment, in real time, if they are not central to helping develop those policies, and if they are not central in helping to implement and evaluate those policies. It does not work, no matter how smart we all are. It does not work if we're not actually including people in that conversation and in the actual development of those policies. And on the second point of integration, so integration, I forget who was sort of mentioning this in the last panel.
Rooker Johnson.
Certainly requires contact. People need to be in contact with one another, right? It also requires shared access to resources. But there's, actually, to what you were just speaking about, there's internal work on beliefs, on deeply held narratives, on deeply held ideological beliefs that has to be done. Contact is not enough. Demographics is not enough, right? It's not destiny. We actually have to do the deep work of getting people to think about the pond of white supremacy that we are all swimming in, the way that we are internalizing that for ourselves, for myself, for yourself, and how the things that we feel like that many people believe actually have nothing to do with race actually always do have something to do with race. This country was built on the backs of stolen labor. There is nothing that is not race-related in this country. And race is a thing in and of itself, right? It's become its own thing. Racism doesn't have to be connected to other things, but other things are connected to racism. We have to be real about it. Because we are all swimming in it means that we all have to be aware of it. The more aware we are, the more likely we can beat back what we've been taught about ourselves and about each other. So those two things I think are really important, and I'll lift up more sort of as we go along what might be some of the really important organizing principles to lean into as we're helping people develop what those policies are and as we're sort of engaging communities, and what it really is going to take to have the kinds of conversations needed to shift those kinds of attitudes.
Terrific. So let me start by talking about and getting you all to talk about the area where the largest tranche of dollars that can be helpful are located, and that's with the federal government, right? Because, Phil, you were identifying some of the things in the Obama administration that you thought were really helpful and that you thought were useful and that you thought, should there be a change in Washington might come back again. But I wonder if what just happened is not a cautionary tale for us. I mean, you can't do serious, sustained equity work in 4-year tranches, or even 8-year tranches, to be frank. So how should we diagnose the reality that, we have elections every 4 years, we can change whoever's in Washington. The kinds of plans that you're describing that, or dismantled, the kind of litigation that you and I have been involved in with HUD, right, has been, we got a rule last year and they tried to suspend the rule this year, right? You can't do this work successfully with that reality. So what ought we be doing either to embed practices within sympathetic administrations that cannot be undone? What should we be doing ourselves in terms of our own maybe organizing work to think about how we give longevity to some of this work? Because we can't just keep going back and forth and think we're going to make some sustained progress within our communities.
Well, I'll let Jack speak to the legal or litigation part of that answer first, I think. I think the case that we just did together is a good example of how to embed policies. I mean, basically, that policy, which is going to open up whole new neighborhoods and communities for Section 8 voucher families to move to, it's going to change the whole rent structure in about 24 metropolitan areas. It was suspended by Ben Carson, and we sued, and it's been now reinstated. And the reason it's going to succeed is because there's, I have to say, dedicated bureaucrats inside the federal government whose job it is to implement it and to make sure it happens. And that's why Steve Bannon and his cohort are so intent on dismantling the federal administrative state, because it's the federal administrative state that embeds these policies, these progressive policies, and is I'm sounding like a supporter of the federal government. I'm not, but it's what we've got, and these as my colleague Megan Haverly recently wrote, the attacks on the administrative states are attacks on civil rights, and that's what their intent is. Because it's the administrative state that upholds those values over time and through it, even an administration as retrograde as this one. That's a partial answer to your question. I think that's one way we embed.
Jack?
I want to amend what you said in response to this particular question. I think there's a reactionary project underway that is designed not simply to roll back civil rights gains, as we have seen, and could talk about, or roll back even the New Deal and Great Society policies, but really to sow a profound skepticism about any government and the value of any government.
That's right.
And indeed, to defund government. The tax increase or cut that's just been passed is going to be devastating. Perfectly devastating to all sorts of national and state and local policies that have been able to help people. And once that is entrenched, and once there are life tenure judges in place to resist the attacks to that, you could have a 30 or 40 year turnaround even if a liberal or progressive majority reasserted itself at the national or state level. Right. So I think it's a very important battle now to persuade the majority of people, black and white, that government matters, that it can be positive, that it can be the source for sustaining their education, their health, their capacity to find employment, their ability to work through life and come into old age. And all of that is in direct assault.
And how do you do that? How do you convince, are the actions of some state governments who have been kind of, resistant to this rollback at the federal level, is that the way to convince people about the value of government? Because how do you do that?
It's not my specialty. I'm glad you're head of the legal defense fund.
I'm just saying.
I do think it helps to have states in which positive policies are underway that have been shown to be successful, and you can turn to people and say, you don't want or need to do this. Look what happens if you've done the other. Look what you can do if you have these sort of policies in place. There's also, and I'll stop this harangue, it seems to me there are two great American political values. One is liberty, one is equality. And we sort of swing between the two of them over time. Liberty is about every individual having the right to do what he or she chooses. It's a choice thing. And we assume that the sum of those choices is the best thing that's possible. Equality is always other regarding. How am I in connection to you and others? In the 1960s, one of the powerful parts of the achievements of that era is it was a very equality-minded time. We are now, I think, over at the polar edge of the liberty time, when everybody is saying, if I get what I want, that's all I really ask from government.
But isn't that because we failed to properly, this is going to sound great, monetize the value of equality? I mean, you know, people think of equality in the way you described, as though it's about, you know, this other person. That even if you are a white person, you benefited from the narrative about this country as a place of equality brought to you by the Legal Defense Fund, civil rights activists, people in local communities around the country. That was not brought to us by the federal government. That was brought to us by courageous people who pushed this country to be what it said it was going to be, and then everybody took the dividend, right? The moral high ground. I mean, a businessman in the international arena can walk into a room with people from all over the world, and at least up until recently, and they would be the American business person, and that meant that they stood for certain things, for certain principles, whether they actually carried them out all or not. You were cloaked with this narrative, and they didn't earn it. And we kind of let them get it for free. So in some ways, I think part of the equality piece where people feel like that's like an option on the menu is because we've allowed people to think that pursuing equality and justice is like giving free stuff to black people, as opposed to doing something that actually elevated this country, you know, as Derek Bell would say in the interest convergence theory, you know, elevated this country internationally in terms of the Cold War and our moral authority in the Cold War, but also in terms of business and all the other ways in which even the narrative about what this country is premised on these ideas that came out of the civil rights movement. And I just don't think we allowed them to just take it for free, I don't know how we would have done it differently, but there is a way in which I feel like maybe we've lost that. I don't know if there's a comment on that.
What would you say at the local level?
Yeah, and let me just add to this, Christine, for you, given what Jack and Phil have said, look, we can't just say for 30 or 40 years, like we're not going to be educating our children well, we're going to have terrible communities, right? So if the government, if it turns out that it doesn't work out, right, and people don't believe in government and it doesn't work, what do we need to be doing at the local level to ensure that we're being, you know, still honest and true to our obligation to our children and to our communities?
Yeah. Well, I feel like this brings up a really important contradiction that we have to hold when we're organizing. And there are several contradictions, and I think people like to choose one or the other, or battle one or the other, but both of them are true. There is a real urgency around the needs in communities, and there are policy solutions that we could move quickly on and pass that would benefit people immediately and like relieve some of the suffering that's happening. And that's important to do quickly as possible. Somebody yesterday had a comment about like, where is the urgency of the moment? We cannot lose the urgency of the moment. That feels important. Oh, your brilliant sister said that. And at the same time, we need to still have the patience to, you know, build the power, do the relational organizing. Relationships are so critical. Relationships between people, relationships between spaces and people, relationships between institutions, they're so important, and we can't choose one over the other. There's this, like for us at ACE, when we're organizing, if we're not building a base while we're organizing, we've turned into policy people.
What does that look like when you say building a base? How do you know when you've built a base?
Thank you. Right. So there are some issues where actually every now and then there are times when you can kind of quickly pass a policy. There's like political will for it, and all you really need to do is like show up, say your comment, and you know, you get to mark off the win. And nobody was engaged in that process. You didn't ask anybody about what that issue was. You didn't say, do you want to join in? Will you go and speak at this thing? Will you stand up and, you know, well, can we have a press conference? Can you, like, we didn't engage anybody who would then be part of the group of people who would not only win that thing, but then demand the next thing, or make sure that that thing gets implemented well. If we're not, we're sort of like a union for the community. People pay dues to be a part of this movement, which is amazing. But if we're just passing policy and we're not doing that base building work, first of all, the policy could go away very quickly, you know. And secondly, the policy in itself is never enough. And so we have to start over again the next time. We're starting from zero every time. So our work is really to bring in people around any of the issues that have real energy around them, to politicize them, and then move them from their issue of personal concern to the next issue that may not have as much to do with them, but is still part of like the set of things we have to do together, and continue to build that power. We are coming up against real organized money, and we don't have that on our side. We've got real organized people if we do the work. That's where we can build power for power. We do that at the ballot box, we do that in the streets, we have to figure out how we're actually contesting for power. And we have to make sure then that we are both doing the slow, relational, base building work and the urgent, important policy work at the same time. We can hold those contradictions. That feels really important. I lost the first stream of your question,
No,
sorry.
it's okay. You know, a great example of this where you just said we're up against this other well-funded kind of organizing is around something that I know, Jack, you and I both care deeply about, which is the Supreme Court. And it's really interesting to me when you see people interviewed, you know, they interview, it seems to me, incessantly the people who are supposed to be part of Trump's base, or at least part of the kind of conservative groups, and they ask them, you know, are you fed up with this president? Are you? It's always alarming to me how many people, this is man on the street, woman on the street, say, yes, but you know, the most important thing is the Supreme Court. And you know, when we do a person on the street in our own communities, that's not what we say. We don't say the Supreme Court is really important, and yet the Supreme Court really is important, right? We were talking, you know, earlier about, you know, a Brown, but you know, if we talk about Brown 1, if we talk about Brown 2, and then we talk about those two cases in 1973 and 74 that really had the most powerful effect on education, San Antonio School District versus Rodriguez, in which the Supreme Court, you know, upheld the use of property taxes as a way of funding education, and Milliken versus Bradley, when the Supreme Court said that you could not require inter-district busing, right? You couldn't bus across district lines, which essentially was the signal to white people that you really could run away from integration, that white flight would work. They couldn't chase you, you know? These are two powerful decisions that transformed the whole project of school integration. And somehow we haven't embedded that as a really important marker and the importance of the Supreme Court, and we haven't done the base building around why that's important. Elites will be talking about it, but it's not something that people in communities understand is important to what's going to happen in their own school system or what's going to happen in their own communities. So Jack, I know we all think the Supreme Court's important, but it feels to me like the conversation is always happening about who's, you know, at kind of among the elites, but it's not a grassroots subject, at least on the progressive side.
I agree with you. The right can say, I'm pro-life, or excuse me, pro-life, and I'm for the Second Amendment. And the courts will give me that. But I think our communities have not fully appreciated just what you've said. And let me add to it in two ways. If there's success out of the 1960s efforts, it seems to me I can point to three of them. In the employment discrimination area, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 turned into a very powerful tool to desegregate previously all white industries, not just, you know, and government and the professions, et cetera. It did so because the court was led to say that if there's a racially discriminatory impact or effect, that is enough to put the burden on the employer to have to explain themselves or to allow further racial integration. In the voting rights area, the same thing. The court said if you've got patterns of racial sort of disparity in voting in areas that formerly kept blacks from voting, those patterns alone are enough. And indeed in school desegregation, the court said once you've been shown to be a violator, we will wait until you show us that you have unitary schools and we'll look at the impacts or effect. Well, now what did the Supreme Court do in the mid-1970s, in addition to the cases you've talked about? They said we are going to hold that the only violation of equal protection comes if you can show intent to discriminate. I can show a smoking gun actor who has done something bad. You can have all sorts of discriminatory patterns of unfairness. We're going to close our eyes to it. They did the same thing in Title VI, in which they said you can't sue as a private person to say that an entity who gets federal funds has a disparate impact in their behavior or their consequences. You've got to show intent there. So they took away the most important tool, it seems to me, we had to say, here's structural racism right in front of you. It's known to you. As government, you could do something about it, and you're not doing it. And that needs to be rolled back. We haven't really talked about that because it sounds like a technical issue. The person on the street's not going to say, I'm worried about the intent versus the impact standard. But it's huge for all sorts of work that we do. Add one more thing and then I'll stop. Here in 2007, the court said even a voluntary school district effort to integrate children across racial lines that uses race as a device to do that has presumptively violated the Equal Protection Clause if you're trying to create integration. And so every school district now knows it's either dangerous or potentially illegal to take integrative action. Right. That was a devastating decision by the Chief Justice.
True, but I want remedies. So that's you're right, that is true. And my concern is that we all know this to be true. You and I know this to be true, but we haven't come up with how do we communicate the message that you just communicated so powerfully and eloquently, and that I'm going to clip and put on social media later to, to people, the people that we represent, in a way that makes it a powerful top line, issue for them, which it really isn't and wasn't in the election. And I think that we have to reckon with that reality. Phil, just one more comment from you, and then we could maybe go to Baltimore.
Well, sure. I think part of the problem is the Supreme Court and its distortion of the Constitution. But there are also these now almost 20-year-old decisions of the court which could be fixed by Congress. The Sandoval case, which Jack mentioned, which basically took away this powerful disparate impact tool from Title VI, which was starting to be used to attack disparities in healthcare, environmental justice, transportation. Just when it's starting to be used in those ways, the Supreme Court pulls it away. Congress has had 18 years to reverse that with the stroke of a pen, and they haven't done it. Well, at least those years when there was a Democratic president, they could have passed the. That's on Congress, and it's also part of educating the base too. The other decision is the Gonzaga University case, which basically said that unless you use a very particular phrase in a federal statute giving rights to individuals to sue, then you can't enforce federal statutes on behalf of individuals. Now, what this did is it erased the ability to enforce hundreds of federal statutes, which Congress had fully intended to be enforceable, but they didn't know before this decision came out in 2002 that they were supposed to include this special language. When they passed the law in the 70s, they weren't aware that there would be a future decision that. Congress should have fixed that. I mean, that's basically taking away the power of the people. And removing our access to court. And I have to say, this is hyper-technical, but it's about, what somebody said 2 days ago, the credible threat of litigation. And it's what Betsy Julian was talking about. We have to actually go to court and have access to court and bring as many cases as we can to challenge racism, challenge segregation, whatever it is, challenge these racial disparities. But without these technical tools that the court has taken away, we're not going to be able to do that. And Congress has the power. These are not constitutional issues. Congress can restore this access to court that's been taken away.
Can I just jump in really quickly?
Yeah, 30 seconds, and then we go to Baltimore.
Sure. So I just want to say two things. One, it is true that, community folks are not thinking about the technical difference between whatever case around impact or intention. But they know what that is, and they care about that. I think what is missing is a space where technical folks and regular non-technical folks are regularly interacting with one another, because we get that, we know what that means. And in fact, there are, in Oakland, there's a Department of Equity that's intended to look at the racial impacts of all of the decisions made within the state's or the city's policy practices, policy decisions. So I think the two things I want to say is we are missing spaces where not just across races, but across
That's a good point.
types of knowledge, we are interacting with one another. And then secondly, it does feel to me like federal stuff is oh my gosh, right? There's not a lot I feel like I can do. I don't really, But I know that there's real energy on the ground. I know that there's real energy in California. I think we cannot, just because that's where the sort of big concentrated power is, does not mean that we should like not do the work locally, regionally, statewide, right? The state laboratory stuff. I feel like that's really is where there's not only a lot of energy and power, but like there's some success that's been shown, and we should perpetuate that.
That's great, and this is one of the reasons why we have, we have 3 organizers on our staff at LDF, because it kind of keeps that energy and keeps pathways for those sustained conversations to happen, and keeps us figuring out when we're not getting, we're not saying it the right way, or what we're saying is wrong. I mean, because the key is also to hear back that, like, actually that's not what the community is interested in. They're interested in this, because there does have to be an integrity about this thing too. Yeah. And trying to balance out those interests is really important. So let's go to Baltimore. I don't know who's in charge. No one's given me instructions.
Thanks, Cheryl. This is Rob Lieberman. I'm on the Faculty of Political Science here at Johns Hopkins. And thanks to the panel for a really stimulating and somewhat sobering set of comments. But as I said, I'm a political scientist. So I'm thinking about, as you're all talking, and I feel a little daunted being on sharing the virtual stage with 3 lawyers and an organizer, but thinking about power and politics as the context around all of these questions and really important points that you're all raising about remedies and directions toward remedies. And my short comment before I open the floor to questions has to do with, I think, the political context in which this is all taking place. Jack Boger mentioned a few minutes ago, quite rightly, that we're in a very dark political moment that's characterized especially by, I think, deep and now generations old polarization or even tribalization around racial issues that makes this an especially daunting task. Yet, I think if we look honestly at history, on the one hand, as Richard Rothstein has powerfully written, the federal government was sort of present at the creation of a lot of the segregation that we experience in cities, especially today. But at the same time, there was a moment when the federal government became sort of unexpectedly a great champion of integration. And I think we need to keep that in mind. And I think we need to think about what are the politics that we can engage in that will nudge us back in that direction. And I think a lot of that has to do with finding opportunities at the state and local level and in communities, as Christina's quite powerfully talked about. And I'd love to hear hear us back up and think a little bit about what are the political both challenges, but also opportunities that a very complicated and, as Jack said, dark moment like this create. So I'll leave that on the table. I know we have at least one or a couple of questions from the audience here in Baltimore. So let's start over here. So let's collect a couple of questions and then we can throw it back to the panel and go back and forth between here and Berkeley. Yes, please, ma'am.
Since this conversation is about doing more than talking and next steps, I wanted to ask why there's so much focus on creating intervention programs as opposed to focusing on changes in policies that are actually perpetuating inequities at all levels.
And then one, go ahead, please.
Hi, I wanted to know, because I hadn't really heard about this, but sort of what can we do, or what is the feasibility and the role of getting money out of politics as we try to engage in policy and practice change?
And then let's take one more in this round from Baltimore, please, sir.
My name is Steve Stern, and I would say that I wasn't going to talk at all, but 45 years ago, I had the blind luck to meet Otto Kerner's daughter and married her, and I'm still lucky to be in that relationship. Your comment, Jack, and Cheryl, and some of your thoughts. This conference is, I should say that I hope that everybody takes this question or comment with the spirit which I'm offering it. This conference is about racism and inequality. There's been almost no conversation about inequality. And inequality is not necessarily, though it also is, a racial issue. And inequality may offer, Sherilyn and Jack, some areas of real commonality that cut across a wide range of the kind of identity issues that separate us. And Fred Harris talked about Reverend Barber yesterday. Lester Spence here in Baltimore talked about Reverend Barber and the war on poverty. And I wonder whether that recasting of much of the same conversation, in your opinion, might offer some hope, Christina, to the kind of political coalitions and political power that we clearly need to recapture.
So we have three questions. One was about money and politics. The first question, I'm not sure I understood. It was, why aren't we suggesting policies? Although I think we have been, but we can talk about what those should be. And the last question was about whether we should be focusing more on inequality and poverty without race as a way of building coalitions. I think that's right. So anybody on the panel? I'm happy to jump in as well.
Why don't you start?
Okay, I'll start. So I think for the first question, at least since I've been here yesterday, there have been a number of policy prescriptions. In fact, everything has been almost policy prescriptions of what we can do and what we should do. I often say that policy is actually just, if broken down, a collection of investment decisions. And that we are always making investments in our society, and that we have the ability to make different kinds of investments than the ones we've made in the past. And so I've said in the past that, our investments in the criminal justice system 30 years ago was a decision. We transformed the criminal justice system and created a kind of system of mass incarceration over 3 or 4 decades by investments. It didn't just happen free. The prisons didn't just build themselves. We built prisons. We built an apparatus in our court systems. We built new courthouses. We made new positions for new district attorneys. We made all of that happen. And we used that as a way to house problems of poverty and mental illness and joblessness, but it was still an investment. So policy is about the investments that we decide to make, and we're always making them. So we have the power at this moment to make different kinds of investments. I don't want to hear about the fact that we don't have any money and the deficit and the tax cut. We'll still make investments even with the tax cut, because we always do. And the only question is, what are we going to invest in? And that's why I'm suggesting that we need to have our eyes open to understanding all the ways that investment dollars go in particular directions. When they decide that they're going to build a sports stadium in your community and they give certain tax breaks to those developers, those are investments that your community has decided to make in baseball, which I love baseball, or football, or soccer, or whatever it is. But those are investments. And if you're not tracking those investments, then you're not engaged in policy. So that's one. 2, money in politics is huge, so powerful and important. Another place where, maybe Jack will talk about this, the Supreme Court shows up with Citizens United. But even places that were making some nascent efforts, like North Carolina, where Jack lives, which had, created a system of public funding for judicial races, for example. As part of the kind of omnibus voter suppression legislation that was passed in that state, they got rid of the public funding of judicial elections. Why would you get rid of that? Why wouldn't we want our judges, who we want to be impartial, right, to have their elections, if they're to be elected, governed by public dollars rather than having them go to private individuals who give them money? And then the last point on inequality and whether we can build bridges, I think there's always that opportunity. I think it is sometimes just hard to make it successful because there is a racial dividend that is very cynically deployed to convince people that so long as you are a step above where black people are, you're still better. And people get invested in that dividend. So I think that's a very powerful organizing tool that has had some success, but very often that success has been stymied by the investment in race. And when I say the investment in race, I mean not coming from black people, but I mean coming from white people who want to divide and who don't want black people and people of color to be in coalition with other people who are also part of that inequality gap. And so they cynically deploy race. And I think we saw that in 2016. So I welcome suggestions on how to do it differently.
Let me make a point that comes really from post-Reconstruction time, and William Barber talks about it a lot, when white conservatives in the 1880s and 1890s overreached and really took actions that were oppressive to white farmers and yeomen. They turned in coalition with African Americans and created a populist party, which in places like North Carolina and elsewhere in the South, Kansas, really took some power back. And of course, were eventually crushed by the Jim Crow movement. But in a sense, I would suggest that the tax statute that was passed may present the same kind of opportunity from overreaching. When we start to see white folks who have their health care cut, their disabilities taken away from them, their old age Social Security pensions cut, the unemployment cut way back, all of those things that are the projection of how we're going to bring some kind of balance back to the federal government, there's potentially an opportunity to talk there and say, don't you realize you're in the same boat we're in on this, and all of us need these things. And so it's an inequality theme, rich versus others, that actually has a very strong racial cast to it. So it's a possibility. It could fail.
And just just to follow up on that, if you look at this on a regional level, going back to something Myron Orfield was talking about yesterday, income inequality leads to income separation. And I think Ann Owens at USC has sketched this out, that higher income families with children are separating themselves out more and more into sort of exclusionary, higher performing schools, suburbs, and bidding up the prices of housing, and just that cycle of opportunity hoarding is getting more and more intense, and we're having much more intense income separation by families with children now with this galloping inequality. And I think that kind of intense opportunity hoarding and the way the upper class is separating itself out, I think affects middle class and lower middle class white families in the same way it affects everybody else. And I think there's an opportunity there for coalition on a regional basis, of regional organizing, older suburbs and cities, to kind of come together around a common, because opportunity hoarding hurts everyone. It's taking away resources, and it's almost obscene in a sense, the way that people are turning public schools into private schools in these exclusionary communities. So I think there's a real opportunity to come together around that if you look regionally.
I feel like I want to reiterate the point that racism is a commonality between all of us. We are all suffering from the effects of racism, and I think it is a really false choice to say we have to pick, to use economics as the thing that actually brings us together. What happens, when I first started organizing, I organized with a national organization called ACORN, and ACORN was notorious for having really strong economic work being carried out on the backs of black and brown people, and never talking about race. And so what can happen when you only talk about the economics is that you find economic solutions that are then the access of which are being given to white people. And so you found a good economic solution and black people don't have access to it. We cannot talk about one without the other. That will actually just perpetuate the situation that we are in now. That's a thing that I've learned in my organizing. We actually have to take the next step to say, this is integrated. It's all one part, and we have to be willing to challenge ourselves to know that and feel that and experience that and accept that if we want to really make steps forward.
I agree. We have questions in the room. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'd like to, my name is Milton Reynolds. I'm currently a senior program associate with Facing History and Ourselves. And so the one sort of solution I've been thinking a lot about is really one of reclamation and the reclamation of history. It's evident in your book, it's evident in Professor Rothstein's book, it's the work that Brian Stevenson is doing. But the history that I think is important that we reclaim is our history of investment in eugenics. right? Because if we want to understand the patterns of resource allocation or resource embargoment, the entitlement that is fueling the resource hoarding patterns, we need to understand that these are rooted in deep notions about heredity in biology, and that the purpose of eugenics was to naturalize social hierarchies and to legitimate them. And so Nazi Germany has been an excellent foil for the United States, but the United States has not reclaimed that history in a meaningful way, nor has Great Britain. So it's not a surprise that Brexit hit and that we've seen the political movement that we've seen in this country, particularly because the narrative that moved that movement was purely eugenic. And Donald Trump has made several statements that suggest that that's the case. So I'm looking to 2050 and the demographic shifts that create the possibilities of coalitions, but they're also the shifts that are creating some of the patterns. And if we went back to the late 1800s when eugenics emerged, we would see the same demographic shifts inciting some of these patterns. And investments in universities to promulgate these narratives of racial and biological differences. So with that said, California has a powerful role in textbook adoption, second only to Texas. And so I think it's important to understand that the battle for the narrative of this country is largely controlled by the battle for the narrative of history. And that whether we're looking at the fight against ethnic studies in Arizona, the recent battles in Colorado, Texas, we know that the narrative is that's what's being shaped. And so California is in a unique position, really briefly. Just 2 weeks ago, a bill was dropped, 1099, that hopes to seek redress for the estimated 153 survivors of California's sterilization program. California led the nation in sterilizations, and so it's a history that we need to reclaim. But if we're able to reclaim this history, not only will we be able to understand racialization and shift away from these identity fixations, which I do think are feeding the patterns of tribalism, but we can also understand that some of the resentments that poor whites are struggling with can be, in many cases, traced back to their racialization because, again, class is a marker of fitness within all groups. And that's one of the mechanisms that allows people who are feeling disenfranchised to be pitted against others. And so I just want to suggest that perhaps the reclamation of eugenics history and an ownership of the United States role, not just in promulgating that history, but continuing to invest in it, might be one way to build the capacity, but also the conceptual reframing of an issue in such a way that we can deal with it, both in terms of the intrapersonal aspects of it, but also the structural material aspects.
Thank you very much. That's very powerful. Can you, is there a website where people can learn about the California bill that you described?
It's not up yet, but the folks who will largely be carrying it, Center for Genetics and Society that's located here in Berkeley will be hosting a screening of the 20-year anniversary of Gattaca at the Brower Center this Thursday, this coming Thursday. And I think there'll be opportunities to find out more about that bill there, but there'll also be a robust connection and conversation about the relationship between eugenics and tech and biotech, which is also an important thing.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let's take comment from this side, or a question.
Yes.
Or remedy.
Christina, you mentioned not having policies without having people backing it. And I was wondering to what extent are we overlooking culture and common language as a tool to really rally the people? Ta-Nehisi Coates talked about how he really learned how to write from hip hop. And me personally, I learned outside of the classroom, before inside of the classroom about, the global world from the music and the culture that I was in. So what extent can we use that as a tool?
And let's take one more on this side, and then we'll answer, and then we'll come over to this mic.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask about your thoughts on how we can use welfare programs, social safety net programs, and policies in a way that furthers equity. I think we've had a lot of really great discussion around housing policy, around neighborhoods, around infrastructure, education. I'm curious your thoughts on the social safety net and how those policies in a state like California, where we have some political will to move in an equity direction, potentially could be shaped as drivers of equity.
Okay, I'm going to throw that last question to Phil, but first I'm going to ask Christine to answer the question about culture and commonality.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to really appreciate your naming that. I commonly hear that culture kicks the ass of any good argument any day of the week, right? Like the fight for people's minds is one thing, the fight for people's hearts is another, and the use of culture is the strongest way to win people's hearts over. music, art, images, practices, right? Like we really do need to, I think one of the tragedies of investment really is around investing in movement art and movement culture. There are cultural workers out there, particularly, I mean, we're in Oakland, or Berkeley. There are movement art workers all over the place, and they are living in poverty, and they are doing this out of the love of their heart. That actually is a place where if we did some real deep investment in culture, we would find much more dramatic shifts than if we were just trying to make the good argument on these issues.
I think that's really powerful, and I actually agree that in these moments, I'm thinking about this a lot, this moment in this country, and we are having something of a culture moment, which is actually quite encouraging. But these are the times when there does need to be serious investment in culture, because out of that expression comes the kind of activism and engagement that actually is going to undergird and support these movements, and we see that historically. Phil, on welfare, and NJAC on welfare and safety net.
Well, I was just going to say something about eugenics for a second.
Okay.
North Carolina, oddly enough, state in a pretty conservative frame of mind these days, nonetheless passed a statute acknowledging the sins of its eugenics commission and setting up a process through which those who were the objects of sterilization could receive recovery. I mean, sadly enough, many of those people were deceased or out of the statute of sort of parameters, et cetera. But for anybody interested in other states, it was a way to bring to visibility again a whole 40 or 50-year period during which there was regular sterilization of people, most of them people of color, but not all, by county welfare boards and others, or state commissions.
Phil?
On the social safety net, of course, we need a strong social safety net, but I think the pieces of the social safety net that are perhaps the most important are those that contribute to economic mobility over generations. And I hate to say it, but I think, stable and secure housing is pretty fundamental for every family. And we're in a country that's only providing 25% of the housing assistance to families who can't afford decent housing, and we have homeless families in every state in this country, and that's the very foundation of the social safety net: a secure place to live when you're growing up, that you don't have to be afraid of being evicted from, or living in a shelter. So. That's number one, and I think there are aspects of the social safety net that have to do with economic mobility, basically a free path to higher ed for low-income kids, and really strong workforce development jobs programs to get kids, starting in their teenage years and early 20s into a real path to work. So, that would be my contribution, in addition to all the basics, the health care and everything else. But I think economic mobility has to be, I think, key, and thinking about the next generation always.
So we had one question here, two more here, then we go to Baltimore.
My name is William Walker, and I wanted to refer back to Camille Charles's remark yesterday of the fact that society breeds anti-Blackness. And I found it interesting because I felt that she had more to say about that and wasn't able to really illuminate that. And that's what's really difficult about the whole intersectionality, and how some of these dialogues have to be led by the folks that have been oppressed so that we can really get to the root of the causes of how to build equity. If we know that 1 in 3 men in prison are African American, and we know that prisons are outside of our local areas, but our urban areas, but our urban areas have reduced crime and incarceration rates in tandem, why don't we abolish the prisons, since they are the largest line item on the California budget, and redirect that money into local jails to take care of the violent offenses that are in the prisons, and for the nonviolent ones, putting that money into education and finding ways to, if our prison budget is, I think, 40% of our state budget, that's a lot of money that could go toward education, considering 60 grand is going toward a prisoner, whereas we spend less than half of that on a pupil.
That's great. I just want to say this is certainly the moment to be having those conversations, right? Because we are in a period, notwithstanding the comments of Attorney General Sessions and others, we are in a period in which crime is at a reduced level. There are select jurisdictions where there has been an increase in violent crime. Obviously, Baltimore is one of them. But it is true that around the country, crime has decreased, and so we should be asking, what are we doing with the dividend from that? And I think there are lots of things on the table about that. I've been really heartened to see on the front end how increasingly prosecutors like in Philadelphia are making decisions about what they're not going to charge and how they're going to be, smart on crime. We were having this conversation a little bit yesterday. My sister and I were having a sidebar about, okay, but what do we do about the people who were imprisoned? So it's really interesting to talk about, legalization of marijuana now, but if we now recognize that marijuana is not that dangerous, what about the people who actually are in prison, or the people who have records as a result of having been in prison? Is there an expungement? What are we doing to address? And I think this came up with two comments about like the apology, Dr. Nguyen this morning. Like when even our larger society admits we made a mistake, right? Now we're treating opioid addiction as a public health problem, and we didn't treat crack that way. Or now we recognize that stop and frisk was not necessary to reduce crime as we learned in New York after LDF and the Center for Constitutional Rights and so forth sued at the NYPD, and we're working on that settlement. So now what? Now that you've recognized that, what happens to the people whose lives were stolen in a wrong-headed policy? Do we just keep it moving? Or do we do something to make them whole again, or to at least give them a chance to have their lives back? So I think, your suggestions, I think there's a whole menu of suggestions around what we should be doing with this moment, given the reality of where things are in terms of violent crime, and also our opportunity to think differently than the hysterical thinking that led to mass incarceration, decades ago. So we had two over here.
Thank you. Please. My name's Richard Page. I came here to escort a blind visionary, Carl Anthony, from whom I learned that the poor will suffer most during climate change, especially as the waters rise, like in Hunter's Point, where the radiation soil samples were substituted yet again, and a public group, Green Action, had to discover it, how important we are. I saw a sign over the door. It said, "What are you afraid of?" as I entered this room. Art moves movements, as you said. What am I afraid of? As the bespoke moderate white man, where's my education been? What have I paid attention to? My own benefit? I found out. I took the curriculum as the first panel asked. I took the curriculum of this conference. I came back. And as I listened, sometimes it was hard to even stay in the room, as my shame and blame issues prevented me from hearing clearly. So that's a small remedy, is my responsibility to cut through little boys' defenses and be a mature, compassionate adult. I live in rich communities, not because of wealth, but because of diversity, of the richness of culture. There's a movement somewhat spearheaded in Berkeley called regenerative communities, not just sustainable, where the idea is what has meaning once we're past thinking that materiality is the meaning. And so to build cultures which have the meaning of richness is a small possibility that could grow. For myself, I'm privileged to be in the room, the resources that have come, this erudite faculty. Thank you. And is there a curriculum for my Episcopal Church, which is under a black Archbishop, Curry, beautiful man? There's $3 million devoted to racism. Not a lot, but within our church, we could study a curriculum. What curriculum would you recommend?
Where's Facing History, Facing Ourselves? Where'd you guys go? So there are any number of curriculums that faith groups can follow and should follow. And I do want to just make sure I thank you for that comment, because I do think that, I certainly feel this very powerfully at this moment when we are in such a very difficult and challenging, and I think very dangerous time in our country. Really, we haven't even talked about just violence, the violence of this moment, not the violence of economic crimes, but the violence of racial crimes and homophobic crimes and so forth, and that we take seriously the importance of building communities around us that are affirming to the values that we believe in, and we have that power. We have that power to try and do that and to live in that, and I don't think that's off the table. You know, I litigate, but I'd like to think about those things too, because that's what's going to sustain us to get to the other side of this. But I'm going to just ask that, you know, perhaps you get to the folks from Facing History about what curriculums they have available. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you all for being here today. I have two questions. So one of them was, we have a lot of systems that were built with the intention that they were for whites only. And now we are utilizing those systems for the community as a whole, but we are focusing most of the attention on changing the people who are going into the system versus changing the systems. So how do we reframe those conversations to work on changing the systems to fit the people versus changing?
Can you give an example?
So we have, like with our education system, so it's built on this sort of white-centered culture that this is how, and ableist system, that this is how children are supposed to behave and they're supposed to conform. And if they don't conform to that or behave a certain way based on my cultural norms, then they're in trouble. And we don't do anything to kind of intervene in those systems legally. I'm in Iowa. In Iowa, I don't know if you all have seen it in the news, they have little pine boxes, so they're putting the kids in boxes. And in Iowa City specifically, they build a pine box and put it in the room, and then they put the kids inside of the box as punishment. And so they found that all of the kids who were put in the box, I think last year, were Black or kids who had disabilities. And so you have a system like that, which is, I don't know why you would utilize it, but it's definitely not a humane system, first of all, but it's also not a culturally competent thing, and it's not sensitive to people who have disabilities.
Can you see me afterwards about
sure.
that?
I was going to say, get to the lay of the fence.
Another question that I have is kind of in response to the last question from Baltimore. How do we empower young advocates to kind of address the emotionally violent tactics of gaslighting and tone policing when they are in these conversations and rooms, when rather than being as an ally or accomplice and listening to and uplifting and amplifying the voices of people who are impacted by the policy decisions, there is a lot of shame and blame, and you said this the wrong way, so I'm not going to listen to it. And why are you talking about this instead of that? Kind of ignoring the historical aspects of racism and inequality and the intersectionality between those two things. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to let the panel take a shot at anything they want to take a shot of. This is the last round because then we have to go. So we'll start with Christine. Go.
So two things on the things that you just brought up. So first, I just want to say, I mentioned I started at Acorn, and so the organization I work at now, ACE, I consider one of the Phoenix organizations, right? We created ourselves after Acorn died. We had a bunch of the same staff. We had a bunch of the same, history. The culture of my organization came from Acorn, and I was thinking that it was culture neutral, which is ridiculous because it was white culture. And I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is that there are not culture neutral spaces, that in fact we have chosen a culture to follow, and that is the predominant white culture, and that if we really want success for our folks, we have to be more realistic about all of the cultural practices that exist and create a space where we can all be there fully in our full selves and full dignity. And on the point of sort of call-out culture, I'm actually deeply concerned about the role that call-out culture is playing both within our Black movement spaces and within sort of the broader multicultural spaces. I think that we have got to have, part of it is we're just trying to get the boldness to stand up and say, you cannot continue to get away with that kind of behavior. You actually have to check yourself. But that is not very welcoming. Nobody wants to have that conversation. No one wants to be shamed into never wanting to say anything publicly again. We really do need to reshape the way that we are having our conversations. I think a lot of us have been encouraged to lose our curiosity, to really get to know one another well, to lose our humility in these conversations because we are trying to stand up so boldly in our dignity that we've lost some of our humility and we are not seeing the humanity in one another. And so we've got to really actually be able to have courageous conversations where I can say to you, what you said actually reads this way to me, and so I would hope that you would change that in the future, but also I don't know how to say everything right, and I don't actually know everything, and so I want to have some humility and some curiosity, and I want to be in relationship with you.
Jack.
Well, that was so powerful. I don't know what, I was going to go in a completely different direction and may do it for 2 minutes. I think we can, because I couldn't begin to get where you got there, it was good. We've got a lot of policies that we can re-engineer in ways that will further things like racial integration of housing that we ought to take a look at. Let me give you an example that I've long been fond of. We have $71 billion a year in mortgage interest and local property tax deduction. $71 billion. We could, if we had a new electoral majority, say we're going to continue to give that to communities that take their fair share of low income and non-white people. And if they don't, 5 years from now, they're going to lose 5% of that. 10 years from now, they're going to lose 10% of that. And over time, you're going to lose 100% of your mortgage interest deduction. White folks who say, I'd really like to be in integrated settings, but I've got to worry about my property values, would all of a sudden say, if I'm worried about my property values, I want to make sure I have a racially integrated and socioeconomically integrated community. I'm going to go to the realtor and say, stop steering people. I'm going to go to the people who've done exclusionary zoning and say, cut it out. We need inclusionary zoning. It's a very easy way. The other thought is the same kind of idea. If Stanford and Berkeley and heaven forbid, Southern Cal and other leading institutions were to say, we're going to give a plus to kids who come out of high school who've gone to racially integrated or socioeconomically integrated high schools. You get that if you've been in those schools. You don't get that if you've been in a racially exclusive setting, white racially exclusive setting. Parents who now say, oh, I'd love my children to go to school in a racially integrated setting, but I'm worried about their getting into Berkeley, would start to say, get more children of color, get more socioeconomic, and schools could do that without sending a dime. They do it now where they say if you do APs or you do, debate, we'll give you, make racial integration one of the criteria that's a plus. Not that you don't have to do it, but if you do it, it's a plus factor. Those kinds of ideas are out there for your refinement. I'll stop.
Well, two brilliant comments to follow. Okay, so, we've had, if you read Richard's book, 70, 80, 90 years of social engineering to get us where we are today. Highlighted in the Kerner Commission report 50 years ago, and we have really been perpetuating and replicating a lot of the same patterns ever since with very marginal, some positive things have happened, but we're, as the data that's been displayed for the past 2 days show, we haven't really come that far, and we're as divided in many ways as we were 50 years ago. I really appreciate what Christina just said, because I'm often in situations where I get called out. I've been working on these issues for a long time. I'm a dedicated civil rights lawyer. I've been working in community, but the ways the dialogue keeps shifting and changing, and one is often, especially coming into communities as a lawyer, saying the wrong thing. And I appreciate places and spaces where people cut me some slack and recognize my good intentions in a sense. And I like to be able to have real conversations with folks and not worry so much about the way I'm saying things, because of course I'm always going to say things in a way that are heard the wrong way. So I really appreciate your comments on that, and I think I'm a believer in changing structures, and that'll change hearts and minds. But I think ultimately we have to do both at the same time, and we have to be in dialogue with each other and reach some consensus in rooms like this about where we need to go. And that'll hopefully eventually lead us to the kind of policy re-engineering that we need to do. So Thank you.
Phil. Well, Baltimore, is there something you want to say to wrap up?
We've got two, no? Okay, no, I think just to wrap up, to tie together some of these comments, I'll just make one final comment. I think one of the great triumphs and promises of the Kerner Commission report was the idea that we as a society shouldn't have to choose and don't have to choose between promoting economic equality and racial equality. And I think one of the tragedies of the politics of the intervening 50 years has been that our politics has forced that choice on us. And I think trying to recapture the overlap and the complementarity between racial equality, the promise of racial equality, and the promise of economic prosperity for all, I think is one of the promises. And I think that's the direction that a lot of this conversation has gone, which I very much appreciated. So thank you all very much.
And with that, I am going to ask for a round of applause for this extraordinary panel and turn it over to John Powell.